Hello everyone and welcome to week 7. This week the focus for our conversation is invisible work, or that work which is often unpaid depending on who is doing it, or work that is often low paid because it is work that involves caring for others.
And unpaid work is very much a political phrase that we've used since the second wave feminist movement, since the 1970s, recognising that many women were doing work at home, and it was work. It wasn't leisure. They weren't sitting around watching telly, although I have to say that my mum did quite a lot of that. However, there was work that women did that was not paid and not even recognised really and valued, and certainly not valued in terms of being remunerated with money. So we're going to have a look at domestic work in Australia and abroad, care work, how we might think of that not just in the home but more broadly, and do we have a moral obligation to care for others in our communities, and then this idea of the commodification of care, where we go out to the market more and more these days to get care needs outsourced. To make it clear what I'm talking about with unpaid work, it is sort of the domestic work that you probably all do at some point, where you're doing cleaning up, even if it's cleaning up the bedroom, shopping, cooking. It is work, it's not leisure. For some people maybe cooking is leisure, something that they really enjoy to do in their spare time, but for many people it's work they do, it's work they have to do to survive. Childcare as well comes into that, caring for other family members. Many people later on take care of their parents, and it's anything to do then with purchasing goods and services for the home. So it is work as opposed to leisure, putting your feet up and reading or playing sport or whatever else it might be, but it's usually not paid for unless you contract for somebody else to come in and do that, and that's what I would call outsourcing. The ABS data on unpaid work, and they do actually now measure this, is that it can include voluntary work, so broadly unpaid work is voluntary work, and you might know about the graduate awards here through Career Services, where you can get some recognition for your voluntary work because employers like that, but it's voluntary work that you would do through an organisation, caring for a person who's got an illness or a disability, or as I said, if you're caring for older people because of age-related problems, caring for children less than 15 years of age, domestic work in your own house, and this is the sort of definition they use when they're collecting data on unpaid work. But it's only been included in the census 2006 that the question was asked about how much unpaid work you do. However, there's been measurements of unpaid work in various other ways since around 1990. So some of this data from 2006 shows that between 1992, so this is a long discussion from the 1970s through continuing on today around unpaid work in the home and whether women should get paid for it, and it is predominantly women who's done that work. But what we've had, and I talked a bit about this last week, is that we've got an increased number of women in the paid workforce as well. So between 1992 and 2006, women did increase the number of hours that they were in the paid workforce by an hour, on average, and 45 minutes. But they continued to spend as much time at home on domestic labour. Men's paid work didn't change, so they weren't reducing that or increasing it, but they did increase time on household labour. At that time, in that period, men were doing about 2/3 of the paid work and women were doing about 2/3 of the unpaid housework. And that would include childcare. So you can imagine in a household where there's small children, sort of preschool, that's quite a lot of time and effort. They also found, so this is the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that women without paid work did more housework than women with paid work, which kind of makes sense. But women with paid work do more work overall, both paid and unpaid work. Men with paid work do 4 to 5 hours less domestic work, whether they were working full-time or part-time. So they were doing less than women by that number of hours, whether they were working full-time or part-time. And generally, whether working or not, men do less household work than women do. Women with part-time jobs do about the same amount of work, interestingly, as unemployed women. This is 2006, the average amount of work that was spent on unpaid work. To get this into this sort of political statement about this being unpaid work into the Australian Bureau of Stats it was quite a win for feminists to have recognition of that labour being counted in the national statistics. A few years later on, Barbara Pocock has done a lot of work in this area. She reckons that this would have been the 2011 census. On average, women spend about 33 hours and 45 minutes on household work per week. Men spend about 18 hours and 19 minutes on household work a week. But there will be many of those women who are in part-time. Those averages tend to increase, of course, when you've got children at home. And as I said last week, I've spoken to many young women over the years who've made the decision, because they're already aware of patterns of who does what unpaid work at home, that they've already made the decision that if they have children, they will work part-time rather than work full-time and still pick up most of the household work at home because their partners already don't do that equally. In 2014, we were at the top of the list around the world for the amount of unpaid work that women were doing. So this is not just a discussion now in Australia, this is a worldwide discussion that we're beginning to have around paid and unpaid work. And now that there is more recognition that men are picking up more of that household work, but overall they've only increased at about 55 minutes. Women still do less household work now than they used to do, but the argument is that overall there's less household work done, not that men are necessarily picking up the slack. So the question is, are people hiring more cleaners or outsourcing or, having more takeaway or whatever, so getting other people to do that work, going out to the market in effect, or dropping standards? It still shows that these days, even in households where the woman is the one doing the full-time work and the man might even be unemployed altogether, women still do almost half the housework. So this is a little clip I've got from the Sydney Morning Herald, a bit of a discussion on national television, which I tend to think is a really good thing that we're having these discussions now.
Housework, how good is that? How good is that?
Just be careful how you trumpet this,
I guess we've got to take, I mean, it's small gains. I think the pace, I would describe the pace of...
Call it for what it is here, come on.
It's glacial, yes.
Roger,
but,
it's 55 minutes.
Yeah, we'll have parity in about 30 years' time, which I think is not
it's
bad.
all progress. baby steps.
Unfortunately, most of that will be brought about through women doing less. So it's not so much men
they're getting lazy, are they?
I think women are.
Don't provoke me, Michael.
Women are finally learning to relax their standards, I think, when it comes to that.
So there's this gap,
we're just
isn't
learning
there?
to live in a dirty, bloody house, as opposed to you guys doing more work.
Yeah, we're doing more work, women doing less work, so there's a gap of about 1.5 hours, which means, as Virginia said, standards are slipping, or more people are hiring cleaners.
Well, yeah, I think that's part of it, and I suppose there's things like robot vacuums and the like, which are
meant to be pretty good.
Which are useful.
I'm one of those.
No, they get stuck in a corner and they don't move. They spend the whole day going dong, dong, dong. Hey, that little figure that was really intriguing to me, though, was what happens in a household once children come along and the percentage of paid work that women do. And that's interesting. Children arrive and women's paid work just plummets and often doesn't return.
That's right, yeah. So we've seen quite a profound shift in people's attitudes towards the roles of men and women when it comes to raising kids and women participating in the labour market.
Yeah.
But it hasn't really translated into much change in actual behaviour, particularly, as you say, when the first child arrives. We get this very sharp divide between what men and women's roles are in the household. And what's really interesting is even when the children get older and the care requirements get less, and even when the kids have finished school, that gender divide still persists. It's like it's not renegotiated.
They sort of can't get back in.
That's right.
Look, we could talk about this all day, but we will let you go. But if you had to summarise sort of the state of the nation, if you like, the health of the household in Australia in a sentence, using this, what would you say?
Look, steady as she goes is probably the way I describe it. There are many, obviously, Hilda reveals many problems that exist in our society, but it also shows that it's not a shambles. That we sometimes, this impression we sometimes get from a lot of the coverage is that it's all
that it's a real struggle at the moment, and you don't get that impression.
No, look, that's a perennial. That's what life is. Life is, for most of us, is a struggle.
Oh my God!
Existential here.
No, he's going dangerously close to a former Prime Minister, isn't it? That life
wasn't
meaning
meant to be easy.
easy.
That's right, yeah.
Watch it.
This is a table I've taken from the ABS website, and it's their analysis of unpaid domestic work from the most recent census in 2021. Things to note are that unpaid domestic work is still being counted in the census, which is a good thing, that almost 2.5 million people provided unpaid assistance to others with a disability, long-term health conditions, or because of old age, and that almost 3 million Australians do unpaid voluntary work, but there has been a 19% decrease from 2016, which might in part be due to the pandemic and the lockdowns. Finally, 27% of both males and females do between 5 and 14 hours of unpaid domestic work per week, they say, but there's no further breakdown of that available yet. However, a HILDA survey, and HILDA stands for Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia, a HILDA survey also in 2021 and reported on in December 2021, shows that women do almost double the hours of unpaid work compared to men.
In terms of unpaid work in the economy, unpaid work does not usually feature as a matter of course in sort of mainstream economic analysis. So we tend to get a skewed vision, and that's a point that feminists have made for a long time, that when we talk about work, we're only talking about paid work. We're not including all of the value of this unpaid work as well. And so what the argument has been is that we need to do an analysis of the total labour that people do. And people have done that sort of thing. So this is the Australian Bureau of Stats has done that. And back in 1997, they said that the value, if you replace, so if you think about things like cleaning and you work out the value of that, if you have to go out to the market and get somebody in to do it, or cooking or whatever, then you can put a dollar value on those services if you have to get somebody in to do it rather than you doing it yourself. So if you do that sort of replacement value, then in 1997 the ABS calculated that that unpaid labour being done across the country was worth about $261 billion. And it wasn't included in our GDP or gross domestic product figures at all. GDP being the paid value of goods and services that we sell, so the monetary, where it's got a monetary value. Now, at that particular time, that meant that for every person over the age of 15, that was the equivalent of almost $17,000 of work was done on their behalf. At that time, men were contributing 44%, which is a sizable chunk, and women 56% to that $261 billion. The most recent figures I've seen on that are a bit more conservative, but this is when you start to add the market replacement value of some of this work, and they do say they've done this fairly conservatively. You can see that we're looking at a total of $565+ billion a year. The percentage of GDP seems to have dropped, but still a goodly percentage of the total value of our gross domestic product. Why are women still doing the majority of unpaid work? According to a study by Connell back in 2005, women feel like they're accountable for the running of the household, that it is their responsibility for the running of the household as well as for the overall welfare for the children as well. So it's kind of their job, their responsibility. Men, on the other hand, feel as if they have a choice about whether or not to help. And if you hear that language of help, I still hear my husband use it, and it infuriates me because it implies that he's helping me do something that is my job. And that's the difference. So that's the importance of thinking about some of the language that's used. When people are helping you, they're assuming that it's your job. And I notice that even with very young people, they still often assume that it's the woman's role to look after the household. So some attitudes haven't yet changed on that. We talked last week about varying feminist views around the place, so I thought I'd just come back to the Liberal feminists. They would argue that the problem with housework is that it's unpaid and therefore devalued. And this unpaid housework, of course, makes women then dependent on men. You're not getting paid for your work. And one of the really big, important discussions from the 1970s was around women having economic freedom, so that if women had money of their own, they could then choose to do what they wanted to do, leave a partner, for example. Marxist feminists, however, tend to say that this is a remnant of the feudal era, still gives men that sort of feudal power over women as well. well, where they're the boss. And I've seen that in some domestic violence situations where certainly men have decided they were the boss in the household, and it is very much a sort of lordship attitude that they might have. But Marxist feminists would also talk about the social reproduction of capitalism there as well, that when women are doing that unpaid work, when they're feeding their man, making sure he's got clean clothes, sending him off to work on time, etc., that they're actually keeping that male workforce in good condition. To think about care then more broadly, thinking about it as the reproduction of society. So Marxist analysis often took account of production, where you're making goods and services, and reproduction is where you're reproducing society. And all societies have to rely on care work to reproduce the society. So that's not just in a biological sense as the obvious way of reproducing society through having more children, but there's also in that social sense as well. We do a lot of things just to reproduce ourselves socially. And without care work, the argument is, society would actually cease to exist. So that's something for us to think about, the importance of a lot of that unpaid work. Different cultures, of course, use different strategies of caring, but broadly speaking, it involves providing dependent people, so people who aren't able to do for themselves because of age or disabilities or whatever, to support their basic biological needs, but also their emotional and psychological needs as well. So that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about caring and the reproduction of society. So care theory takes into account that care is a practice that reproduces not just society, but the institutions we have, the relationships we have, all of the social arrangements that we have, if you break society down into all its relevant bits. And it is contrasted with the productive work where you're making goods and services, so digging up the earth and sending off the material, the coal or whatever, to another country is seen as productive work, doing something, making something out of it. And that does contribute to society, but the point is that also so does care work, all of that unpaid work as well. So Engster says that caring, by contrast, involves a subject. It's direct. It's not indirect. It's direct, but because it involves a subject confronting another person and responding directly to their needs. So it is in your face, so to speak. It's direct, and it involves supporting the well-being of another person. Whereas you could say that digging up the earth and sending coal off to China will be caring for other people, ultimately perhaps in the way of electricity or whatever, but it's not direct. It's much more indirect. Caring does not necessarily, according to the theorists, involve a friendship. You can care for somebody without being friends with them, but it is this entirely other-oriented process. You're involved in the care of somebody other than yourself, even though care for yourself is regarded as care as well. The scope of that is the basic biological needs, such as food and water, etc., but it is also about developing and sustaining people's capabilities, at least at a very, very basic minimal level, to be able to do things, to connect with others, to read and to write, etc. And helping individuals where we can to avoid suffering and pain. The goal of caring, says Engster, is to help individuals to achieve at least a very minimal basic level of well-being, at a minimal survival and as much basic functioning as they're able to achieve. Providing care in a caring way involves attentiveness, sort of empathy and awareness of the needs of the person that you're caring for. A responsiveness, being able to respond to their needs, engaging in some sort of dialogue, asking them what they need if they're in a position to be able to respond to that. And respect, which Engster defines as the equal recognition of the other. What I wanted to ask you was if one of those three qualities, attentiveness, responsiveness and respect, is absent in the relationship, would that still be caring work, do you think? care as a moral question, morality usually being about what's right and what's wrong. A number of theorists have argued that we do have a moral obligation to care for other people, and if we think about it, most of us at some stage, we all have been, obviously as babies and small children, being dependent on somebody else to care for us. But as we go into old age, many of us will also be needing other people to care for us as we get older as well. We kind of have that duty of care. We need to keep that duty of care in mind, that at some point in the future we're going to need it again. Other theorists have suggested that a moral obligation exists just because we all are vulnerable and fragile at various points as well, and we need to keep that in mind, that we will probably all need to be cared for, not necessarily at those dependent ends of the age spectrum, but also at other times when we're unwell or just needing some extra help. And that we should bear that in mind, so that we all have this moral obligation to care for others. The danger of such an obligation, that it's a moral obligation, has been that historically women have been the ones who've been charged with that moral responsibility. So that duty to care has always rested on the shoulders of women. Because of my work in foster care and stuff, I've read lots of stories of parents who've abandoned children. And nobody seems to get all that upset when men abandon children. But when women abandon children, how do you think people respond? With outrage, yes, and even I find, even though I know that, I still have a sort of similar sort of response myself, like how could she do that? And yet right alongside her is some other man who's done exactly the same thing. So we have a different attitude towards women, an expectation that women will have that responsibility. So care, therefore, is not a gender-neutral phenomenon at all. Women have historically done the majority of the care work and still tend to do the majority of the care work. And often that obligation to care for parents at the end of their life falls on women as well, and which is an extra burden, because it's usually women who are in the middle of career, they still have young children, and then they pick up the care, elderly parents as well. One of the things that we can do is take that care work out to the market now. So in our contemporary society, we could do that informally. So just have some sort of paid or unpaid arrangement with neighbours or friends or whatever to pick up some caring responsibilities, and maybe look after, they look after your children and you look after theirs in turn. Or do it formally through the market. So putting your children into childcare, putting elderly people into retirement homes, that's how it would be done formally. But Rutger Klassen asks whether market-based care undermines the caring motive, that moral obligation that we have to care for each other, because of its reliance on contracts. So you contract out to a childcare centre, or you contract out to a retirement home, and because there is an idea of a corrupting influence of payment. So as soon as we hand over payment for something, often we think that that undermines altruism and some of that caring motive. How we think about care is becoming increasingly important, because that old gender order of women staying at home and picking up their responsibility is now collapsing. Hasn't totally collapsed, but it is definitely on its way out. Some theories from Nancy Fraser. When she's been thinking about this, she's been thinking about what sort of political or welfare system do we need so that we can get some gender equity in all of this care work. And in particular, how can we organise care work so that it is fairer all round? One of her options, she's got three options. Her first option is that we have a universal breadwinner model. So do you know what the breadwinner model is? We used to have an idea that, and it goes back to the early days of federation in Australia, that the man was the breadwinner for the family, so earned the money for the family, and minimum wages were based around the man as the breadwinner. And so that's kind of been the trend in Australia for a number of years, that the man is the breadwinner. What she's saying is, let's move past that, have a universal breadwinner model, and probably in many ways we've kind of shifted towards this quite a bit, perhaps more for economic reasons, so that we encourage women to do paid work, and then we pay, and if women are doing the paid work, then they can afford to get that care work picked up, formally or informally, but they can afford to pay for it, in other words. So you can have your children in childcare, get cleaners in, etc. However, it does assume, of course, that paid work will be enough to cover paying for care, and that will depend very much on what sort of work the woman is doing, because some work doesn't pay very highly, and so you might not have any money left over. And there are certainly many people who make the choice to stay at home and look after children because of the cost of childcare. At the upper end of the spectrum, maybe it really is worthwhile to do just that. The other option, she says, is the caregiver parity model, where carers actually receive some money to support their informal care. And then that will enable women to move between paid and unpaid work a lot more freely and without the considerable financial penalty that they often have now. The downside on that is that it doesn't necessarily change the situation career-wise for women. They might often still be seen as on that mummy track and therefore won't be taken seriously as contenders for CEOs, etc. And of course it doesn't change the association with care with femininity either. It's still associated together. The third option is to make women's current life patterns the norm. So women today are often combining earning money and caring for their children and their households and their parents, etc. So what she's suggesting is that a post-industrial welfare state actually should set things up so that men do the same thing, so that men are also enabled to have time out for caring, and we stop putting this gendered focus on care, that care becomes care, not care associated with femininity. So this is what you might call the universal caregiver model, where women's lives become the norm instead of the breadwinner model, and women going out to work is more the masculine model in many ways. All jobs assume that workers are caregivers too, so we no longer assume that it is the woman doing the caring work at home. All jobs have a shorter working week to allow time for caring responsibilities, and all workplaces would have strategies in place to enable employment while caring. And if you have a look on the University of Adelaide website, look up family-friendly workplace, you'll see what some of those strategies might be. Flexibility in the workplace. I have to point out though, I love the University of Adelaide, but we've only been family friendly for the last couple of years. It's very, very recent. But I think this will become more and more. I think actually Nancy Fraser is quite prophetic in this, that this will become more and more the norm. And then employees won't shift all of the care to the market. We still will have childcare centres and cleaners or whatever, but we'll have time and energy to do some of that informal care work at home. Her other point, I think, is really worthwhile considering, that civil society then would be a site of care. So it would be publicly funded. There would be an expectation that everybody is cared for in our society, and that could be then be publicly funded, but could be organised by local institutions in each local council area, for example, and then people who don't have children or who've retired could perhaps pick up some of that care work if that's what they wanted to do. So in many ways it's quite a different attitude to the often cold, callous attitude towards we have towards people. I wanted to move towards talking about care in other sectors, so it's sort of away from the home as well. So what's happened since the 1980s and the shift towards what people do call neoliberalism is that many government services, if not most, but certainly many government services have now been outsourced as well. So we outsource at home and put our children in childcare. Government departments have been outsourcing. And the sector that I'm most familiar with is with child protection, and so you'll find that there's a lot of not-for-profit organisations who pick up foster care and residential care, etc., for children in out-of-home care. So they're in state care, but they're looked after, but the caring for the children is outsourced by other organisations. So there's been quite a boom in this industry from around about 250,000 now, as the government has outsourced more and more services to not-for-profit organisations. Unfortunately, often that means that agencies are pitted against each other as they compete for funding. And according to child's worth studies, often because they are competing and then they will be going in on price, sometimes that price doesn't actually cover the cost that they're expending, and then they're reliant on charitable donations to cover their costs. And there has been, although there's been some change here, a very low level of unionisation, so there hasn't been a lot of bargaining power. But there is a bit of change. So many of these care workers, there'll be childcare workers, workers at home, disability support workers, have been notoriously underpaid, often don't have very good working conditions either, and often are casually employed. So they're often seen as bad jobs. Many times there's a lot of older women working in these sectors. And part of the difficulty has been the association between this paid work and unpaid work. It's been difficult for people to kind of get together with this cultural split between care working being what women do and being what women do at home, to outsourcing to organisations who provide that care work, because of that kind of split between public and private. So it's taken us a little while to get sorted there. Often that work has been seen, rather like emotional labour, has been seen as unskilled work and therefore natural for women to do as well. However, we have had in the last few years some unionisation, and that's been fantastic, so that community workers in this particular sector are now being paid at comparable levels to other sectors of the community. So that's been fantastic. We've had childcare workers protesting as well, and they want to be paid equal to men in manufacturing.
Of course, there has been considerable discussion about care workers in Australia because of the pandemic over the last few years. The aged care sector has been much criticised. Many workers have left that sector, and the current Labor government has advocated for what Annika Wells, the current aged care minister, calls a significant, meaningful pay rise. Nurses in New South Wales have been on strike several times this year, arguing they are understaffed, underpaid, and risking their lives because so many colleagues are absent due to illness, not only with COVID, but other illnesses too, and there are no replacements for absent staff.
I wanted to move on to thinking about domestic workers, so people who come into homes. We don't hear a lot about that in Australia now. It used to be the leading paid work for working class women up until the 1950s. There's still a few people around, and then it's dropped off. So you can see that quite a few in the early 1900s, and then in 1996, there are still some domestic workers in Australia, but that's declined quite dramatically. And certainly as factories, even though factory work might be seen as very difficult, arduous, boring work, for many women, instead of doing domestic work, factory work was a relief because they could be unionised, because they had company at work, because they had a damn sight more freedom than they did working in somebody's home. And that was mostly because the employment was very scattered, so they didn't have very much company. There was usually just the boss and the employee. Lots of terrible relationships between women in these situations. Might be stable work, but usually the wages were quite low. There's a horrible history in Australia of state-coerced domestic work. So children who were historically in out-of-home care were expected to go and work in domestic situations, become domestic servants, and the boys were supposed to become labourers. And that applied, if you know about the stolen generations, that applied to those Aboriginal children as well. They were trained to be domestic workers. There's been a massive decline in that field now. But what's happening around the world is that people from poor countries are going to wealthy countries like Australia or the UK in particular, and they're working there and then they send money back. So some of those poor working conditions that I talked about before that applied in Australia apply in other countries as well. And many times women won't see their families. Their family will stay home with grandparents. They won't see their children for years because they're working to support that family away from home. These are very low status workers, very much out of sight, very much like domestic workers in Australia up until the 1950s. And workers often lack knowledge of their own rights, but they'll be on call 24 hours a day very often, depending on the employer. Some will have better employers than others. Sometimes you'll hear stories of their passports being removed and their visas being removed as well. So they're kind of held hostage to their employers. And they often experience sexual abuse, as you could imagine, and domestic violence, but don't want to lose their job. If they lose their job, then they lose the money that's supporting their family back in their home country. So they don't always want to report that. Some employers have an attitude that the workers are like family, but if they treat them like family, we have a kind of different attitude, one of expecting more and probably paying less instead of having a contractual working relationship. Au pairs is another trend as the most affordable childcare in Australia. So this is an arrangement where young women, and it usually is women, will travel to Australia, to England, to the UK or the United States, come from Europe and other countries in order to do a cultural exchange for them, and then they'll pick up the childcare and the domestic work. So that's a way for families here to be able to outsource that domestic work.
Here's a website for au pairs in Australia if you want to check that out. There was some controversy back in 2015 when Peter Dutton, then Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, overturned deportation orders for 3 young women working in Australia. He was accused of double standards because he had refused to meet an army veteran trying to get a visa for his Afghan interpreter. According to media accounts, one of the 3 young women was working as an au pair for a family who had donated $150,000 to the Liberal Party over a few years, followed by an amount of $50,000 6 months after the au pair's deportation order had been revoked.
Let's finish today's lecture with listening to Martha Nussbaum. She's an American philosopher and she's developed what she calls a capabilities theory of care, and it's a vision of society that I find both practical and inspiring.
Aristotle had the ingredients of a theory of justice that I think is very powerful, and that is that it's the job of a good political arrangement to provide each and every person with what they need to become capable of living rich and flourishing human lives. Now, of course, he didn't include all the people, but he at least had that idea of supporting human capability. That's the foundation of my own approach. Now then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, a very powerful new approach came on the scene, and that was the social contract approach. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant. The social contract approach was inspired by the background culture of feudalism, where all opportunities were distributed unequally to people according to their class, their inherited wealth, and their status. And so what these theorists said is, try to imagine human beings stripped of all those inherited advantages, placed in what they called the state of nature, where they had only their natural body and their physical advantages, and try to imagine what kind of arrangements they would actually make. The social contract tradition is, of course, an academic philosophical tradition, but it also has tremendous influence on popular culture and our general public life, because every day we hear things like, oh, those people don't pay their own way. or supporting some new group of people, well, there'll be a drag on our economy. So the idea that the good member of society is a producer who contributes advantage to everyone, that is a very live idea, and it lies behind the decline of welfare programs in this country. I think it lies behind many Americans' skepticism about Europe, about European social democracy. You hear terms like, oh, the nanny state, as though there was something wrong with the idea of maternal care as a conception of what society actually does. We also see it in another way in images of who the real man is. The real man is sort of like these people in the state of nature. He doesn't deeply need anyone. He isn't bound to anyone by ties of love and compassion. He's the loner who can go his own way, and then out of advantage, he'll choose to have certain kinds of social arrangements. Of the social contract made certain assumptions that aren't always true. They assumed that the parties to this contract really are roughly equal in physical and mental power. Now, that was fine when you're thinking about adult men with no disabilities. But as some of them already began to notice, it doesn't do so well when you think about women, because women's oppression has always been partly occasioned by their physical weakness compared to men. And so if you leave out that physical asymmetry, you may be leaving out a problem that a theory of justice will need to fix. But it certainly does not do well when we think about justice for people with serious physical and mental disabilities. And in fact, some of the theorists who noticed that said, well, this is a problem, but we'll just have to solve it later. We'll get the theory first, then we'll work on this problem at some other point. Well, my thought is that this is not a small problem. There are a lot of people with serious physical and mental disabilities, but not only that, but it's all of us when we're little children and as we age. How do you think about justice when you're dealing with bodies that are very, very unequal in their ability and their power? And perhaps even harder, how do you think about it when you're dealing with mental powers that are very, very unequal in their potential? And I think that this is a really serious political problem. We have only just begun to understand how to educate children with disabilities, how to think about their political representation, how to design cities that are open to them. I mean, this bridge we walked across, a person in a wheelchair can go over that bridge. But, 50 years ago, that would not have been the case. There would have been steps, and that person could not get to see this beautiful lakeshore. Approach, as I've developed it as a theory of justice, begins with the idea that all human beings have an inherent dignity and require life circumstances that are worthy of that dignity. The areas of life that seem to me particularly important when we think about the capabilities are, of course, life, is the very most basic one, bodily health, bodily integrity, the development of the senses, imagination, and thought, the development of practical reasoning, the development of affiliations, both more informal in the family and friendship, but also in the political community, the development of the ability to play and have recreational opportunities, the ability to have relationships with other creatures and the world of nature, developing emotional capabilities, because I think a lot of theories leave out the fact that we don't want to have lives that are filled with fear, for example. In my my view, people get together to form a society, not because they're afraid and they want to strike a deal for mutual advantage, but it's much more out of love that they want to join with others in creating a world that's as good as it can be.